I am pleased to welcome to our stage Scott Pruitt. I am routinely assured by my friends on the left that he means to destroy the EPA. I wish that were true, but I don't think it actually is. He's not going to destroy it. Quick question for you. So, your home state of Oklahoma, my home state of Texas, Pennsylvania, where I lived for a while, all these states do a pretty good job of regulating the oil and gas industry on their own, which is a very complex piece of environmental regulation. So I look at these things and I think to myself, what's the point of the EPA? I'm sure there is one. Tell us what it is.
So Kevin and I had a little conversation as we getting ready to come on stage. From Texas, Oklahoma, we had this little day in October where we're not friends, but most
it's the only state we ever tried to get back to the Indians.
Well, maybe a discussion for another day. But as far as the EPA is concerned, there is an important role for the agency. There are air quality issues, water quality issues that cross state line, and I think what we've seen the last several years is a displacement of the partner that the EPA has used and worked with over the decades, and those are the states. You know, if you go back to the inception of the EPA and the environmental statutes that were passed in the 1970s, Clean Water Act, Clean Air Act, and others, there was a very important prescriptive model put in those statutes, and the prescriptive model was federalism, of empowering the states to be enforcers and partners along with the federal government with respect to air quality and water quality issues and land issues. That has largely been pushed to the side of the last administration. And states have, rightly so, in my view, started to develop a distrust of their partner here in Washington, D.C. I think I'm so thankful to be working with and for President Trump, who has said we're going to restore that trust. We're going to believe again in the partnership with respect to these environmental issues and be pro-growth and pro-environment, and we can be both. We've been that as a nation for many decades. You know, this old saying that you can't have your cake and eat it too, you know, whoever says that doesn't know what you do with cake. And I think that I think as we look at this debate we've had over the last several years, there have been many that say that you can't be pro-growth and pro-environment, and I reject that. You can be both, and we're going to work at that at the EPA.
So, you know, I live in Houston. We have some drainage problems. There are a lot of puddles around town, all of which are covered by the Waters of the United States
Not
Act.
Not anymore. Not anymore.
As I understand it. Talk to us about this.
Well, very important issue. The President, on February 28th, the day of his address to Congress, did something monumental and very important with respect to this issue, Kevin. As you know, the previous administration issued a rule in 2015 that said that dry creek beds, puddles across the country were going to be treated as waters of the United States. Now, just going back a little bit to the history of the Clean Water Act, traditionally, waters of the United States were navigable streams and waters. They were waters that traversed state line. And I think that is something clearly within the jurisdiction of the EPA. But what happened in 2015 was an enlargement of that, a reimagining of that authority under the Clean Water Act to say, no. What we're going to do is we're going to regulate waters that have a nexus, a connection to traditionally navigable streams and waters. So that literally meant dry creek beds and puddles in certain parts of the country. And that's not an overstatement. So the President addressed that on February 28th, issued an executive order giving us the direction at the EPA to fix that problem. And I'm glad to tell you that within 8 minutes of the President signing that executive order, I was actually at the signing. He and I walked back to the Oval Office. I had my team, we had prepared an advance notice of proposed rulemaking, and I sat with him in the Oval Office and signed that advance notice of proposed rulemaking and kicked off the process within 8 minutes to undo that wrong under the waters of the United States.
Very nice. Very nice. Can you give us some examples of the way in which those new rules were interpreted in a Congress fashion?
Well, I think what Kevin and I were talking about, and this is very important, I think, not just in the environmental space, regulatory certainty. When you look at our economic growth over the last several years, it's been very discouraging. And we've accepted less than what it should be as far as our gross domestic product and the economic growth we've seen. In the finance sector, in the healthcare sector, and particularly in the energy and environmental sector, regulatory uncertainty, I think, has been the greatest impediment to economic growth. As I talk to those in industry, whether it's utilities or otherwise, they say that the EPA has engaged in something called regulatory pancaking, where they will issue a rule one year that applies to a particular situation, and then 2 or 3 years later pass another rule that undermines the previous one. And so the investments that were made by the company, by the industry to meet the standard 2 or 3 years prior are undone within a short amount of time. That's poor planning. As Kevin and I were talking about a little bit earlier, you need a more long-term view. I really believe that those in industry care about the environment and want to grow, and they want to know what's expected of them, and they want to be able to allocate resources. We should celebrate the progress we've made as a country, by the way. Since 1980, the reduction of air pollutants under the NAAQS program, which is the ambient air quality standards, the 6 criteria pollutants, SOx, NOx, and particulate matter and the rest, ozone, we've had over a 63% reduction in air pollutants since 1980. We should celebrate that at the same time of growing our economy. So one of the objectives, Kevin, that we have in the short run is working to provide more regulatory certainty to those in the marketplace, to know what's expected of them. And the Waters of the United States rule was one of those that said, look, we don't know what the definition is. We think the statute says one thing, but the regs say another. And the case law, there's just all kinds of confusion. We don't know how to allocate resources to meet the objectives that are being set out in air or water or the rest. That's one of the best things we can do, in my estimation, Kevin, in the short run, is provide that kind of certainty.
Right. So say if I was building a factory somewhere and there was one of these dry creek beds or these non-navigable waters, in what way would the old set of rules have affected me, and how is that different now?
Well, the first thing you would have had to do, Kevin, is seek permission from the EPA. And it was a land use, you know this, but land use decisions historically and now presently have largely been within the province of the states and local cities and towns and private property owners. And what this rule did, Kevin, was say that with respect to building subdivisions, with respect to farming and ranching, with respect to oil and gas production, any use of land that would affect or impact that water of the United States, whether it's a dry creek bed or otherwise, you had to seek permit authority from the EPA. It was an extensive power issue of trying to assert federal jurisdiction in ways that are not consistent with the history of the Clean Water Act. So the impact of it would have been delay. The impact would have been wait. And this permitting issue is substantially important. The president is talking about an infrastructure package, as you know, Kevin. Roads and bridges, water infrastructure, those types of things. We have something called NEPA that you may be familiar with. It's a planning process to determine environmental impact as you do infrastructure. I've heard stories, anecdotes of it taking 8 to 9 to 10 years to get certainty, to get decisions about those kinds of things. That's not a decision, that's just obstructionism. That's just a way of using these statutes to say we're not going to build, we're not going to do infrastructure. So these are important matters, particularly around the permitting process, Kevin.
Yeah. Talk to me about CAFE standards. What do you drive?
Well,
is it good gas mileage?
I drive a truck mostly, and it gets good gas mileage. I kidded with someone this morning that I come from a part of the country where we like to drive.
Yes.
And
there's really no choice.
Yeah, we like to drive. No, when you're in Oklahoma City, you've got a little ways to go. Yeah. You've got places that take a little while to get there.
I love it.
But the CAF, we were actually, the president was in Detroit. I was with him on Wednesday, and he announced the decision with respect to the CAFE standards. You may not be familiar with this process, but in 2012, the previous administration and the EPA worked with industry to say, we're going to set these emission standards for cars. We're going to set it over a longer period of time, which is, I think, a wise thing to do. 12 to 13 years, so there was a 2025 window as far as these, evaluating these standards. Well, there was going to be a midterm review in April of 2018. And the last administration in December finalized a process, and then within 10 days, 16 months early, rendered a decision that those standards were insufficient and needed to be enhanced. And so, as I shared with people in Detroit, Kevin, it'd be like your kiddos being told you're going to take a test in April of 2018, and the teacher coming alongside and saying, we're not going to take the test in April of 2018. We're going to take it 16 months early. Now go take the test. That, to me, is an issue of fairness and equity. We addressed that on Wednesday. We addressed that in equity. We told the industry across the globe that keep working toward these standards. And we're going to review them in due course, process matters. We're going to keep our word and make sure that we don't accelerate it for political ends. And that's what we did on Wednesday of this week.
Can you tell us a little bit more about where the standards are actually heading?
Well, I think that's yet to be determined. I think that's why you have a midterm review. You know, what should be the goal, in my view, with respect to those emission control standards, with respect to mobile sources, is to actually take cars that people want to buy and make them more efficient. That sounds rather novel, perhaps, but what happens over the last several years is the government will go to industry and say, go build a bunch of cars that nobody wants to buy, and then balance that against the rest of your portfolio that people are wanting to buy, and then just kind of throw it in the mix and say that we're meeting these emission control outcomes. I mean, what should be the goal is to work with those in the R&D sector, with each of these car manufacturers, take trucks, take SUVs, and do all that we can to meet those outcomes with cars that people want to buy, while at the same time providing safety. There's a DOT partnership there, as you know, on the safety side, and all of it's collaborating together, Kevin, intergovernmental and industry, in the benefit of consumers, both the environment as well as safety. So that's some principles I think we should live by.
All right. We talked a little bit about the question of certainty and uncertainty. And one thing I sometimes say that's unpopular is we often have these debates about whether a certain tax is going to be 38% or 35%. And sometimes I would be okay with giving up a couple of percentage points in the other direction if we could guarantee it was going to stay there for the next 30 years. There are some similar dynamics, I think, with environmental rules, where sometimes we're fighting about whether it's going to be X or be Y, and industry wants this, and the environmentalists want something else. What are the chances for developing something that looks like long-term political consensus on this issue, where there isn't really any organic consensus, where you've got an environmental group that is very ideological, that doesn't want any new sources of industry, any new sources of energy, whether they're clean or not, because they are kind of anti-capitalism, essentially. And then you have industry which has a different set of views, and you have sensible people in the middle who understand that there are things that have to be done, but there are better and worse ways to do those things. How do you deal with the broader politics of this? And especially since your nomination was met with such, I'm not even sure what the word would be, panic, terror, loathing?
Joy, celebration.
Yes. I meant among the people we have to convince, not the people who are already on board.
Well, I mean, but your question is interesting because I do think that this process of environment and energy over the last several years and what you describe, we've put on jerseys. You know, we've allowed ourselves as a country to buy into a belief that if you're pro-environment, you're anti-energy. If you're pro-energy, you're anti-environment. Or if you're pro-growth, you're anti-environment. And that is something we just have to reject as a country. We do it better than anybody in the world as far as balancing our economy and our economic growth and being a good steward of our environment. You know, wealthy countries take better care of their environment than non-wealthy countries. You know, so there is a direct correlation between private property ownership, incentives that occur with private property ownership, growth, economic growth as a country, and those countries taking care of their environment and natural resources. So we should simply say and dispel this notion, this notion and narrative that you can't be both. And so that's something, big picture, Kevin, that I think is important. The long-term view, I think, is very wise. I mean, it's not just the car sector that we just talked about, the auto industry that impacts. It impacts the utility sector as well. I mean, as we deliver electricity in this country, government shouldn't be in the business of forcing outcomes on the utility sector. The utility sector ought to be making decisions on what is the most stable and reliable form of delivering energy, electricity, and what is the most cost effective. And making decisions across a cafeteria of options, from fossil fuels to renewables, to nuclear, et cetera. And they ought to be making business decisions. What's happened the last several years is the government has been the one trying to force upon that industry those decisions, picking winners and losers. That's not the role of a regulator. I'm going to say something to you very profound this morning. The job of a regulator is to make things regular. And what that means, Kevin, is it's to give expectation. Here's where we're heading. Here's what we want to achieve after receiving input, comment, voice from all the people that are impacted, and then make a decision. and then allow the markets, allow those in the industry, allow those in the country to then get about the business of doing what? Meeting those standards, empowering them. You know, the states are very good partners. You mentioned the states and the regulatory regime. We have, across this country, departments of environmental quality that have significant resources, significant expertise, and will work with the EPA to achieve good outcomes. We need to get back in the business of that partnership and not being seen as an adversary. You know, I hope the EPA is received better than the IRS in the years ahead, and we can be that kind of partner with the states by sending a message to them. It's about compliance, it's about assistance, it's not about punishment. And let's get about the business of achieving good outcomes together.
So you want to be more popular than the IRS?
Well,
Someone
yes.
once called that the soft bigotry of low expectations.
But you know, you just do a little, and you're going to get a lot done. You know, Kevin.
Yeah.
So
well, you'll probably certainly beat colon cancer in terms of popularity.
I think we're already making good progress, Kevin.
Yeah. Now the EPA actually is a good example of what you're talking about here. So we talk about the problem of uncertainty, which is largely related to the fact that Congress delegates too much power to the administrative agencies in a lot of people's view. And the EPA is often held up as the example of that we give it the Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act, and they go all sorts of crazy directions with it. They take things further than they probably should. But at the same time, do we really think that Congress has the competency to deal with these things on a granular nuts and bolts kind of issue? Or are we going to have to continue with what amounts to a series of enabling acts where Congress says, well, we'd kind of like to have cleaner air, and you guys need to come up with rules to do that? How do we manage the problem of expertise, which is what the EPA allegedly brings to the table, with the problem of democratic accountability, which is why we want a larger role for the legislative branch?
This is a big issue. This is a huge issue that Kevin has raised. And I'm in the camp of saying that Congress needs to be more prescriptive. I'm not one of those individuals that believe that our founding fathers, as they put together this very, very precious framework that we know, where we have horizontal checks and balances between the branches, vertical checks and balances called federalism in the Constitution, that should be respected and complied with. A lot of the problems we have in this country today is that we're not living within the framework that the founders have established. And Congress has been very, very good over the years of delegating authority in an unconstitutional way, in my view, a violation of separation of powers. To say to the executive branch, as Kevin said, we like clean air, so go make clean air. That's not how you should do business, because Congress should be directing agencies in the executive branch in every area, whether it's finance, healthcare, and the environment, to say, here's the framework that you have. You know, the CO2 issue actually is a great example of that. You know, when you look at the carbon issue, we have a Supreme Court case in 2007, Mass v. EPA, where 6 states sued the federal government to say, regulate CO2 for mobile sources. The U.S. Supreme Court didn't say that the EPA should regulate, by the way. It said, go make a decision. You have to determine whether CO2 is something that should be regulated or not. And you just can't simply fail to make a decision. That was the Supreme Court decision in 2007. 2009, an endangerment finding by the EPA, all right? And then you have had 2 responses since. You've had the tailoring rule that was struck down by the U.S. Supreme Court in the UARG decision, and then you have the Clean Power Plan that has been stayed by the U.S. Supreme Court. So two bites at the apple that the EPA is engaged in to regulate carbon. Both times the Supreme Court has said, you didn't get it right. We question whether you have the authority to do what you did. So what does that tell you? Congress hasn't dealt with this issue. Congress has not actually, through the Clean Air Act, addressed this issue called carbon. Because as you look at the Clean Air Act, if anything, it was set up to deal with local and regional air pollutants. It was not set up to deal with this global phenomena that we talk about at times. So this is an important issue that you've raised on where the balance is between delegation and agencies at the federal level acting. The executive branch exists to do what? Enforce the law as passed by the legislative branch. If the legislative branch is not doing its job, it creates dysfunction, uncertainty, and we need to address that with respect to these very important issues.
So, but we do have an executive right now who seems to be very focused on doing things through executive orders and unilateral executive action. At what point do you go to Congress and say, look, we have to revisit these things legislatively?
Well, I would take issue with this in this regard. I think the executive orders that are being issued are to fix the executive orders that were reached before. So I don't think I don't think qualitatively it's the same. I mean, the past administration said how many times? Well, we've only issued so many executive orders, and President Bush did this many, and we haven't done nearly as many as the previous administration. Well, it's not the quantity of the executive orders that matters. It's what they do. It's the qualitative aspect of it. And they, through a whole host of executive orders, overreached, extended, and enlarged their authority. President Trump is fixing that. He's keeping his promises to say, we're going to use our executive power to undo that which the previous administration addressed. Now, what comes next? You know, is, I think, a legislative response, a congressional response to many of these key issues.
And is there somewhere a broad environmental reform bill or series of those bills brewing in Congress somewhere?
Not that I'm aware of.
No.
Not that I'm aware of. I mean, that's not to say that there's not going to be discussion and dialogue. I mean, through the confirmation process, actually in several of the meetings that I had through that confirmation process privately with senators, both Democrat and Republican, there was an expression of interest at the Clean Air Act was updated in 1990, so it's been 27 years.
Yeah.
And so some of these issues that we're talking about, I think it's meritorious to revisit and say, do we need an update to the Clean Air Act to address what is the will of the American people with respect to these issues? How is it going to be expressed through Congress to deal with these issues? How should it be addressed in the framework? All very important policy decisions that Congress should speak to.
Are we ever going to get to a point in our country where you don't have to get the president's permission to build a pipeline?
Well, that's interesting, you know, because, you know, you look at the authority goes back to 1968. President Nixon, through an executive order, you know, got involved in that process, saying it was part of national security concerns. You know, what does the Constitution say about foreign commerce? Congress has the authority to regulate foreign commerce. And so I think it's a very good question. And we ought to get back in the business not of having administrations ebb and flow on whether those things should be complied with. It should really be the constitutional branch that should be dealing with those issues and providing certainty so that people can invest for the long term on pipelines. Yeah. But I'm thankful that the president has addressed the Dakota Access Pipeline and the Keystone Pipeline. That should never have been delayed. It should have been approved years ago, and I'm glad he's fixed that problem.
You don't want the State Department involved in this sort of thing, I don't think.
Doesn't make a lot of sense to me.
No.
Commerce, yes, and Congress, yes, but yeah.
One of the good pieces of political news, I think, on this front is
there's many. There's many. Don't just do a couple. I mean, there's many. Yeah.
One that comes to mind is that while we do have an implacable environmental lobby that's never going to be happy with anything that you do, I mean, there's not. They're never going to be happy with anything that looks like any sort of sensible reform. There's a much larger group of people who care about things like economic growth and jobs. And there are things that we can do really in the short term that should get some of this stuff moving, not just in the energy industry, but also in other things that are being unnecessarily held back by overzealous and unpredictable environmental regulations. So what are some of those things that leap to mind for you that you've seen?
Well, look, I think in innovation and technology, and we mentioned the auto sector earlier. I was just meeting with the CEO of BMW, and he was sharing the things they're looking at over the next 10 or 15 years with respect to some of these emission levels that they're seeking to meet both in Europe and here. It's exciting to hear from them. I mean, I think industry is investing, whether it's in the utility sector, the auto sector, energy sector. We see, I think, we're at pre-1994 levels with respect to CO2, our CO2 footprint. Why? Because of hydraulic fracturing combined with horizontal drilling. You know, we've had a lot of folks think that hydraulic fracturing is something that we've just discovered over the last 10 years. Oklahoma has been regulating that process since 1948, approximately. So it's been around a few years. The difference is that you now have horizontal drilling combined with the fracking process that allows an extraction of natural gas and oil that we couldn't reach before. So innovation has helped us with respect to what? Our CO2 footprint. And because of the conversion from coal to natural gas and the generation of electricity. So I think innovation, technology, Kevin, as we look out over the years ahead, auto, utility, et cetera, working with folks to ensure that we're thinking long-term is going to be very, very important.
It's interesting how quickly things move on this front. I was reading a book that was written not that long ago, maybe 15 years ago, and the great concern of this book was that foreign powers were going to conspire to cut the United States off from its energy supplies that we needed to import. And of course, now we've become, in some ways, an exporter. We're certainly producing enough North American energy to meet our own needs, things move pretty quickly that way. What are our chances, do you think, not only through environmental regulation, but through other sorts of reforms, to letting this sector grow even larger than it has? I mean, I'm from the one city in the United States where when gasoline hits $4 a gallon, everyone sort of cheers. You know, we're happy about it in Houston, not really so much anywhere else.
Yeah.
But, you know, we look around at other countries in the world. We look at places like Norway, which has a very, you know, environmentally heavily regulated economy, but it's also an oil and gas driven economy. We've got a lot more things that we could be doing than we are. And you've got places like New York, for instance, that has a lot of petroleum resources they can't get to because of politics. Now, that's a state level issue, not a federal issue. But there is, I think, even more potential for growth and dynamism there than people probably really even appreciate. You being from Oklahoma, you've had a closer view of this than most people.
Look, I think that markets ebb and flow, clearly. I mean, but going to your point about a regulatory and governmental response, I mean, in the 70s, the view was similar to what you just described. I mean, that our access to energy resources was declining, and it was creating quite a problem domestically. I think what we know now, based upon technology and innovation we were just talking about, we have reserves that are substantial, both with coal, natural gas, oil, and I think the best thing that we can do from a governmental perspective is provide them certainty so that they can invest over the long term to meet those standards that we want to achieve, but also allow them to use technology and innovation to meet those standards. I mean, there's some exciting things going on with respect to clean coal technology across the globe. There's some exciting things going on in the nuclear space, but not here. Most of that's happening in Europe presently because of the disincentives that we've put into play here in this country with respect to nuclear. I mean, if you really care about some of these environmental concerns, nuclear ought to be in the mix. It ought to be a major part of our discussion. So this isn't a matter of, I think, regulators saying, we don't like fossil fuels, we like fossil fuels, we like renewables, we don't like renewables. We need to have truly a commitment and attitude to allow markets to make those decisions, provide the certainty and investment, and the dynamism, as you put it, of the markets to determine how do we best provide electricity, how do we best provide, you know, outcomes on emission measures with respect to mobile sources and stationary sources and the rest.
I have an interest in nuclear power. I first got interested in nuclear and became a nuclear fan because it terrified and annoyed hippies. And that was enough.
And being from Texas, you have a lot of those.
Yeah, a few. I went to school in Austin, you know, but God help us. But then I actually looked into the realities of it, you know, the environmental and economic aspects of it, and it certainly makes a lot more sense. Now, as I understand it, the main economic barrier right now to getting new nuclear plants online is just that the compliance and licensure costs of getting them approved make them essentially undoable for anyone except maybe a government actor. So what can we do on that front, do you think?
Look, I mean, you've hit something terribly important with respect. We talked about it a little bit earlier on just the permitting process. We've accepted this long term. It's going to take 10 or 15 years to do these things.
Right.
Let's just say no. Let's just say no. It's not going to take 10 or 15 years. It's a matter of attitude. Bless you. It's a matter of attitude. And so I think what's key here is saying, look, what is important to our energy portfolio in this country? And if nuclear is important to our energy portfolio, let's get about building nuclear facilities. And let's have a commitment to it. I was with Senator Alexander on Wednesday, and he did a Wall Street Journal piece last December, I think, on this very issue, Kevin. And I believe the American people are interested in this. And I believe the American people see this as an opportunity that we ought to explore. And we shouldn't allow government indifference or government delay dictate to us to say it's going to take 15 years to do that. What was interesting to that end, when I was in Detroit on Wednesday with the president, we went to a facility there where they built planes for World War II. They were putting on a plane a day in that facility. Why did they do that? Because they had to. You know, when are we as a nation going to say, look, we can do anything we set our minds to, let's get back in the business of doing that.
Now, when you talk about nuclear power and you talk about global warming, the people who are most concerned about global warming are also the people who are the most opposed to nuclear power.
I don't get that, do you?
I don't either.
So let me ask you, what are we going to do about that? I know I'm not the questioner, but I think that I'd like to see, what do you think about that?
Yeah, well, I mean, there's always, like corporal punishment. We could maybe bring back the stocks or something like that. I don't know, there's not a good answer on that. And this is one of our problems we have, I think, that's it's difficult to get into, is that long-term sustainable policy reform requires a degree of political consensus across the board. It just does. That's how stable policy reforms happen. But we have an element in the environmental movement that is not going to it's going to make that really very difficult to do because they don't want to see new sources of energy because they think industry is a bad thing as such. There are some of the more extreme ends that are opposed to things like economic growth that the rest of us take, for example, as being a good thing. And at the most extreme end, of course, they think that there's too many human beings on the planet, we consume too much, all that. Now that's a very small part of the environmental movement. But you've got a reasonably large part of it that is going to try to stand in the way of everything. If you look at things like they're trying to build coal export terminals on the West Coast because we want to sell American coal in Asia and China's got a big appetite for it. It's a win-win proposition except for the fact that someone somewhere in the world is going to use some coal to generate power. They don't want that to happen. The thing with the pipelines has been the same thing. It's not that they care about Indian burial grounds or any of the rest of this stuff that comes up. It's they don't want there to be more oil consumed in the world. And this isn't, again, it's not a huge majority position, but it's maybe, between 10 and 20% of the population has fairly strong environmental views that way. So what is the argument we make to them?
Well, I think maybe with that category, hopefully that very small percentage of people, I'm not sure that we can be persuasive. I mean, I do think it's important to involve all voices in the process. I'm optimistic in the sense that and I've experienced this in my capacity as Attorney General and as I served in other capacities. You bring people together, you have intellectual and informed discussions, be thoughtful about it, but make decisions and actually go out and lead. One of the very first things I did when I came into the office, I was confirmed, I believe, on February 17th, and I came in the Tuesday after President's Day, and I addressed the entire agency and talked to those across the country and visited with them about, look, we're going to deal with some very difficult issues, but let's deal with these issues in a civil way. We've lost the ability in this country, and this really troubles me. This is just generally a statement. We don't have political dialogue anymore. We don't have civil debate and civil dialogue about very important issues, and that's across the spectrum. Tax policy, debt, environmental energy issues. We just simply have this intractable kind of approach to say, you're against me and I'm against you, and we're just that's got to change. And I'm hopeful, Kevin, and again, I may be too optimistic or too naive there, but it's an attitude and a belief that I have that as I'm at this agency, I want to reach out to those, hear from them, make informed decisions, but do so with a commitment to pro-growth and pro-environment, and bring people together to achieve that. Again, we'll see. And there is a number of individuals, probably on both sides of the spectrum, that have beliefs that perhaps aren't wanting to have that discussion. Yeah. We'll see.
What's been interesting to me about that, and I've been fairly up close to some of this and going out on gas drilling rigs and that sort of thing, is that industry seems actually more willing to compromise than the environmentalists do. There are a lot of oil and gas exploration companies that not only do what they're required to do of the DEP in a place like Pennsylvania, but will go well beyond what their actual environmental regulations require. Now, part of that is because they know if anything goes wrong, it costs them $1 million a day to be shut down. They don't want that. But part of it's also, they do genuinely care about doing a good job and being good neighbors and that sort of thing. Are there ways to encourage industry groups to follow in the way some of the gas drillers have gone and go beyond what's actually, literally required by the law, and taking a more kind of proactive stance that maybe might assuage some of the environmental.
I think some of it is what I said earlier. You start out from a perspective as a regulator, as a government, that you're going to have compliance and assistance, that you're going to have partners, that you have people both in industry and environmental groups that have objectives, and we can actually work together in partnership to achieve those things. And I've already seen that. And you're spot on right. Most, if not a large percentage of the companies in various industries, they want to meet and exceed, in some instances, the regulations that have been put upon them, and they commit a tremendous amount of resources to do that. They want to drink clean water and breathe clean air. Their employees are in those places. Why do we start from a place at times from a regulatory perspective that they don't, whether it's from a state perspective or industry? So I don't want to be too general here, but I think a lot of it's just attitude. Yep. Attitude goes a long way to how we approach these issues. And if we start from a standpoint, Kevin, of saying we can achieve both, how do we work together? Let's set up a process to achieve both. You mentioned earlier about Congress not speaking. Well, regulatory agencies and the executive branch too have not been very mindful of the process requirements that have been placed upon them by Congress. The Administrative Procedures Act that says, as you do a rule, comment. Why do you do that? You do that because you want to hear from people. You want to say, so how is this going to impact you across the country? And then there's an obligation for the agency to do what? Take those comments and respond to them. and then finalize a rule. That's been disregarded a lot of late. So it is process, it's attitude, it's process, and ultimately partnership at the end of the day to achieve these things. And again, I believe we can do better. I believe that we can achieve good environmental ends. 40% of this country right now, 40% of this country is in non-attainment with respect to those air quality standards that we've had tremendous success, but 122 million people live within non-attainment areas right now. A question rhetorically, why wouldn't the EPA work with those DEQs across the country, those environmental agencies, and say, look, that's not acceptable. How are we going to meet the current standards before we adopt new ones? How are we going to achieve better outcomes? There are 1,300 approximately Superfund sites across the country in some of the most pristine areas of our country and some of the most key economically, the Port of Portland, Chicago, Butte, Montana. There are places all over the country that have been on that list, that national priority list. Now think about that, national priority list. That means that it's a priority. And some of these places have been on the list for 30 to 40 years. Now, I got a question for you. Why aren't we focused upon that? Why isn't the EPA saying that's, so we are. So I've gone into the land and emergency management portion of our office and said, look, that's unacceptable. We need to develop a plan, and there's some exciting things that I look forward to sharing with you about how we're going to deal with some of those Superfund sites real soon. I haven't got it fully developed, and sometimes I get ahead of myself and some of these ideas. I'm going to we got to get everything buttoned up. But let me tell you, I hope to be able to announce to you something real soon about how we're going to approach Superfund sites, those locations across the country, and getting them cleaned up in a quicker fashion and allowing the communities to enjoy the Port of Portland and also see jobs created very, very soon. So there's lots of work to be done, Kevin. Good work that will provide good outcomes to citizens across the country while at the same time growing jobs.
When you were first nominated, some people made us think about the fact that you had sort of prominently sued the EPA on a couple of
they deserved
before.
it. Yeah.
Of course they did.
Yeah.
And my explanation of that was that, as the administrator or someone who's suing it, it's really the same thing. You're trying to get it to do its job in the right way, and we wish you the best of luck doing that. Scott Pruitt, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Good to see you. Okay.